Hello everyone and welcome to another Uncast video. Now today we've got a lot to cover as we dive into building a low power server that still packs a punch. This build will feature 90 terabytes of storage while idling at around 20 to 25 watts, proving that you don't need massive power consumption for a capable media ready machine. We'll also take a look at how much traditional hard drives consume versus SSDs, and we'll compare the power usage of 6 regular HDDs versus 6 SSDs, and have a look at how much difference each type of drive makes in energy consumption. And beyond that, I'll be sharing some essential tips on optimizing your server setup, covering key plugins, tweaks, and configuration to ensure your server is efficient as possible. Oh yeah, and one more thing, we're going to be putting power supplies to the test. Does your PSU really impact energy efficiency that much? Well, we're going to be comparing Platinum, Gold, Bronze, and even a budget PSU to see how much of a difference they make in real-world power usage. Now, the results, they might surprise you as they did me. Anyway, let's get started and jump over onto my desk and let's dive right in. Now, I've always wondered, does a Platinum power supply really save that much more electric than say a Bronze or a budget one? Now this one here, this Corsair RX1000i, is a Platinum power supply. But also for this video, I've bought a Corsair 80 Plus Gold, a Corsair 80 Plus Bronze, and also the cheapest budget power supply I could find on Amazon, which cost £20, which is about 25 US dollars. So theoretically, this one, when idle and under load, should be more efficient and save us power over these other three. So this should be the best, next best, and worst. So we're going to find out in real life, does it really matter? And if I had my server running for say a year, how much money would this power supply save me to say the equivalent Corsair Bronze one here? Now also, I've had friends in the past say to me they don't want to get a 1000 watt power supply because they worry that the wattage on the power supply is how much it actually uses. So for instance, this one 1000 and the other one here 650. But that's actually not the case. The 1000 watt one can take up to 1000 watts if it needs it, and the 650 up to 650 if that one needs it. And if you look at the 1000 watt one here, now one good thing about the higher wattage PSUs is if they're drawing less power, then the fans don't spin up, so they can actually be quieter. But I can guarantee you this one, that fan will probably be spinning all of the time. So a power supply like this is definitely going to be more noisy than a high watt power supply such as this one. But one thing we don't really know is how well these power supplies will all fare with such a low wattage being drawn from them. Well, I guess we're going to find that out. Okay, so the motherboard we're going to be using for this build, you can see it's this tiny little board here. Underneath here is the CPU, it's an Intel N100. So what's interesting about this board is it's actually got 6 SATA ports here. But as well as 6 SATA ports, there are also 2 NVMe slots. So for our Unraid server, we could use these for a pool, and if we were to use 2 of them, we could have maybe a mirrored ZFS pool. But what we can also do, which is pretty cool, is I'm sure you all know what HBA cards are. These allow 8 drives to be added to a server by this going into a PCIe slot, and then a cable like this plugging in here, and this will either go to a backplane, like on the case that we're using in this build that you'll see in a moment, or you can get a forward breakout cable that would go to 4 SATA ports that would be able to connect directly to drives. Now obviously we don't have a big PCIe slot here, so using this is not an option. But I'm not sure if you've ever seen one of these before. Now these are really cool. They basically adapt the NVMe into 6 SATA ports. So we can just plug this in, and now we've got an extra 6 SATA ports on this PCIe slot here. Now, before making this video, I did actually test this board. What I noticed about the onboard SATA ports here is these 4 are pretty fast. If we plug 4 SATA devices into here, then the drives will run at full speed. But plugging extra drives into these 2 ports here, these are most definitely slower. Now, you don't notice it if you're just reading from one drive at a time, which using the Unraid array, that is really what we'd be doing. But if I plug, say, 6 drives into here and do a parity sync, these 2 slots here pull down the whole speed. But putting actually 6 SATAs directly into here in the NVMe, well, each drive runs at full speed. So what I find is we can run 10 drives pretty much at full speed by using these 6 slots here and these 4 here. And we still got 2 spare if we wanted to connect other drives as well, but just something to keep in mind that these can pull down the speed of the whole array. So the motherboard obviously takes laptop RAM. This is a 32 gig DDR5 module that I'm going to pop into here. And another thing we can see is there's an internal header which we can use to plug in our Unraid USB flash drive, which will keep it inside of the case. Now, I'm not sure really if I'm a big fan of that, because I'd have to take the case out of the rack to get to the flash drive if I ever wanted to access it. So personally, I prefer plugging it into the back, into one of the USB slots on the back. And while we're looking at the back here, we've got 4 LAN ports, and these are all 2.5 gig. So quite a capable little motherboard, I think. And for me, this is going to be building a backup server that's very low power that I can leave on 24/7. Now, one more thing about this motherboard. I bought it from AliExpress and I think it cost me about £100, which is about 120 US dollars. I think they've gone up a little bit now, but they're still under 150 US. Now, one thing I found when I received my board is there was no CMOS battery, so I had to put one in. I don't think they're actually allowed to ship them with lithium batteries, so that was missing. So that's something to keep in mind if you actually want to buy one of these. Okay, so I'm going to pass this motherboard over to my son now and get him to build it into the case. And the case that I'm using for this build, I wanted a short 4U case, and it's the Logic case LC4488BWH. Now the front of mine looks a little bit different. It isn't green, the front of mine is actually a blue colour. Now, including tax, I paid £234. It's probably about 250, 260 US dollars. And I bought it over here in the UK from a company called servercase.co.uk. Now you can see here that actually we're not putting in the HX1000i, we're putting in this power supply instead, which is still a Platinum power supply, but it's a bit closer to the 650 watts, the other power supplies we're using, so we figured we'd pop this one in instead. Still a Platinum power supply, but a little bit lower wattage. Okay, so whilst he's putting in the motherboard and getting everything connected up, let's have a look at some pictures of what the case actually looks like. So this is the front. It's got 8 hot swappable 3.5 inch bays, and underneath there's a flap that opens which is lockable. Now this is quite weird design. I'm not really quite sure why they've done it that way, but if we open up that, well, the lockable door, it's locking away some very precious fans. Now, obviously, they must be more expensive and important than the hard drives. But I don't know why they've actually locked away the fans, I don't know, but I guess it's easy to pull the flap and actually access them. But to be honest, on 4U rack-mounted cases, I'm used to the fans being mounted behind the hard drives, actually sucking air over them. But this case is designed slightly different. Oh, okay, let's have a look at this part of the build here, because we can see the cables here that we're using. I'm connecting to the drives on the back plane, which are SFF8643, so that's the target because it's where the drives are. So the host is where it's coming from, and that's the SATA ports on my motherboard. So we've got the target and the host, and this cable is called a reverse breakout cable. They look exactly the same as forward breakout cables, but they go from SATA ports on a motherboard basically to a backplane on a rack mount case. So we can see here various parts of the backplane. On the bottom left there's two Molex connectors which come from the power supply obviously, which power up all 8 hard drives. And on the right hand side, well, bottom right, that's where my reverse breakout cable connects into the target, connecting the motherboard to the drives. And here now in this part of the build, we can see the reverse breakout cable, the host side of it, being plugged into the NVMe-SATA port adapter. Right, so let's just speed through this last part where the motherboard gets mounted to the actual case and the last few wires are all connected up. Okay, so next we need to put the hard drives into these sleds here, which just slide into the front of the case. For this first part of the video, we're just going to be using 3.5 drives. Then later on, when we're doing testing, we'll swap all of them out and we'll just run all SSDs and see the power difference of using both. Now, of course, the 3.5-inch spinning rust drives, they're going to have much more capacity than the SSDs. But the SSDs are going to be faster. But what I'm interested in is just really seeing the difference in how much power each type of drive uses, and we'll be looking at that later on. Okay, so now all of the hard drives are in their sleds, so now we're just going to push them into the front of the case in the hot swappable bays, and then we're going to be good to actually boot up Unraid and do some tests. Okay, so this is how the low power server looks from the outside, so now let's boot up and do some tests and see what it looks like on the inside. Okay, so the Unraid flash drive's in the server and it's all booted up. And we can see here I've got 6 drives, 5 spinning rust drives and 1 NVMe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an Unraid array. The reason I'm using an Unraid array and not a pool, my main reason is because Unraid arrays allow us to actually spin down hard drives when they're not in use. And that's going to save a lot of power. So I'm going to use the spinning rust drives here in the array. So for slots, I'm going to set that to 6. And the largest drive here, I'm going to use as parity. Now the other drives I've got here, these are actually from my old backup server, so they already have data on it. So when the array starts, it will start building parity, protecting these drives that I already have the data on. Okay, so I want to have one cache pool. I'm going to call it cache. And for that, I'm going to use this NVMe drive here. Now, before I go and start up the array, let's just go across and have a look at how much power the server's using at the moment without anything set up. At the moment we can see it's using about 47-48 watts, and what I'm using for this is this Tasmota smart plug here, which does power monitoring. So we can see here the active power is currently 47-48 watts. Now ignore this at the bottom, this is from when I've been using the energy monitoring plug before. So let's go back to the server. Okay, so before starting up the array, there's a couple of things I want to do, which we can only do when the array's stopped. Now, the name of the server is a bit boring. I don't want this one called Tower. So let's go across the settings here and identification. And all of my servers, they normally have a sci-fi based name. So I'm going to call this from Aliens, I'm going to call this Sulaco. Now, one little tip is the name is always here, but the description always becomes before the name. So what we can actually do is we can do quite a cool thing is we can actually, with the description, kind of actually improve the name of the server. So what I'm going to do for the description is put in the class of what this spaceship was. And for model, this won't be displayed up here. We're using an N100 chip, so I'm going to put N100. So when I click apply here, we can see here now I've got my name, but also I've got a special banner for this server. So I'm going to go now to display settings. And you can see here I've got a banner that I uploaded. I'm going to click on to apply. And so now I've got a nice banner matching the name of my server. Okay, so now let's start up the server, which will run a parity sync. And that type of workload is going to spin up all of these drives and be using them all simultaneously. So that will give us a good indication of a workload, which is probably indicative of the most power that this server will use. So let's click on Start. And like I said earlier, all of these drives here, they're from my old backup server, so they've all got data on. So these will each be mounted in turn and added to the array, and then the parity sync will be started. Okay, so there we can see the parity sync is running and all of the drives are being used. So let's go across and have a look at how much power is being used during this workload. Okay, so looks like it's using about 60 watts. I think that's really pretty good, considering there's 5 spinning Rust drives here all being used. So while that's running, what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to install a few different plugins for this server. Some plugins that I just like and I think are essential for every Unraid server, but also a couple that can help us save a little bit of electricity when running the server. So I'm going to go onto the Apps tab here, and the first thing obviously is I'm going to install Community Applications. And the first thing I'm going to install is I'm going to install the Unraid patch here. Now what this does is basically give us things like security updates and various patches. So it's a really good idea to install the patch. So here I'm going to click on Install and agree here to have the patch plugin be able to automatically install patches as and when they come out. And I'm going to install these bug fixes. Okay, so that's done. Now let's go back to Community Applications again. And first I'm going to install unassigned devices. Now for those of you who don't know what this is, it basically allows us to plug other drives into the server that are not associated with the array or a pool and be able to use them with the server. So really useful if you've got, say, a USB hard drive, you want to plug it in and then copy the data from that onto the array. Well, this is the plugin you're going to need for doing that. So I'm going to install this here. And also I'm going to install the Unassigned Devices Plus add-on, which gives us things like exFAT support and also the Mac file system as well. Okay, so also I'm going to do a search for SAS spin down. In case I add some SAS drives to this server, the SAS spin down plugin will help the SAS drives be able to actually spin down. So I'm going to install that. Now currently I don't have any SAS drives in the server, but I do have some around my home lab and I may well pop one in there in the future, so that's why I'm installing this plugin now. Now next I'm also going to install the sleep plugin here. Now this also needs to be enabled in the BIOS for sleep to actually work, and one caveat is sleep doesn't work for every single server, so if you're going to use it, please be aware of that. But if you do get it to work, but using sleep is a really good way of saving energy. You know, with the sleep plugin you can have your server go to sleep and it will use virtually next to no electricity at all. So setting the server to sleep maybe whilst you're sleeping or at work and you don't need it, well, you're going to save a lot of power. If you can have it sleeping for 12 hours a day, it's going to use half the amount of electricity in a year than it would do if it was on 24/7. Okay, so next plugin I'm going to install is Custom Tab. Now this is because on my servers I really like everything to be exactly the same, and I've got various custom tabs here you can see on my main server, and so I'm going to install Custom Tab here as well, so I can have everything set up the same. Okay, so I've configured my custom tab here. Now if you want to see a video on custom tabs, I have done one on my Space Invader 1 channel, so you can go over there and have a look at that. Okay, so because the CPU I'm using in this server is an Intel N100, well, one, I want to know the temperature of it, but two, it's also got an iGPU inside, so I want to install the drivers to be able to use that. So when I'm using a container like Jellyfin, MB or Plex, I can use the iGPU for transcoding. Not only is that going to give me better performance, but it will also use less power to use the iGPU to do the transcoding than it would if I relied just on the CPU. So let's go back to the Apps tab here, and I'm going to do a search for Intel, and what I want to install here is the Intel GPU Top. And as well as that, I want to better see what the GPU is doing, so I'm going to install the GPU Statistics plugin here, and I'm going to click on Actions and go to Settings on this plugin and select my iGPU here. Okay, so the final plugin I'm going to install is the System Temp plugin here. And with that done, I'm going to click on Actions and Settings and configure it. So I'm going to click Detect, which will detect my CPU, and then Save. And then I'm going to select my processor temperature, which is this one here. And the mainboard temperature, I think it's this one here. So the first part of AC PITs here, ACPI, well, obviously that's ACPI as in Advanced Configuration and Power Interface. And the TZ at the end here is Thermal Zone. So this is obviously my motherboard temperature. And the array fan speed, I don't have anything here. So I'm going to click on to Apply and Done. So now I'm going to go across to the dashboard here, and we can see I've got one device warning here. That's because the parity is doing a parity sync. And you can see I've actually got some containers already installed here. So I've got MB here and Nextcloud, which I think running these containers is a good indication of maybe an average workload. And also I've got this Windows 10 VM here as well. Now we can see here now the temperature of the CPU from plugging in that plugin, and also the motherboard temperature. So that's quite useful. Now if I scroll down to the bottom, here's the GPU. Now I don't really like how all of this is set up, so I'm just going to quickly move things around here. Okay, so that's a bit more how I like it. So now the parity sync's been running a little while, I'm going to go back and have a look at the power usage again. And we can see here it's still pretty stable around the 60 watt mark here. But because this is a Tasmota plug, I'm actually going to add one more plugin to the server. So I'm going to go to the Apps tab here, and I'm going to type in Tasmota and install this plugin here. And so again, I'm going to click onto Actions and go to Settings here. Okay, so here are the settings we need to fill in. Now, I don't use a password on my Tasmota web UI, so all I need is the IP address. And the IP address for me is 10.10.20.110. So I'm going to pop that in here. And also what this allows us to do is actually calculate how much power the server's using. Now in the UK, I think it's about 25 pence per kilowatt hour. So I'm going to put 0.25 in here and change this to British pounds and click Apply. So now if I go to the dashboard, I've got my Tasmota power monitor widget here. And we can see with the parity sync going, it's using around sort of 60 to 63 watts. And here I can see how much it's cost me to run this server today. It looks like it's cost about 6 pence. Now the 280 kilowatt hours, obviously this is a new build, and so this isn't actually from this server, but I decided to leave it in here and not reset it, just so we can see, say this was the server and it had been running for a year or so. If it had used over its lifetime 280 kilowatt hours, it would have cost me about £70 to run the server. So I really do like this plugin, being able to integrate the Tasmota power onto the dashboard. Now you don't actually have to use the same plug as I'm using. I just like these because they're pre-flashed with Tasmota out of the box, but you can actually flash Tasmota onto various devices yourself and use it that way. Okay, so let's go back to the main tab here. And now let's think about changing some settings so the server saves power. Now the first, and in my opinion the most important setting is we come to disk settings here, and we want to change the default spin down delay. At the moment you can see here it's set to never. So that means my hard drives will never ever spin down. So the least power this server would use if I don't spin down the hard drives would be the power we saw at the beginning, where it was using between about 48 and 50 watts, because the hard drives will always be active. So what I like to do is set it to 15 minutes, and then after 15 minutes, Unraid will shut down any hard drives that are not in use in order to save power. Now, I know some people out there, they don't really like to do this because they don't like to, say, play a TV show or something on their media server and have to wait for the drive to spin up. But I'm from the generation that remembers VHS cassettes, so we had to rewind those. So for me, a couple of seconds to spin up a drive, it's well worth it with the power it saves, being able to have them spun down. Now, also something else worth mentioning on this page here, we've got this here where it says enable NVMe power monitoring. Now, if I select that and turn that to yes, and let's click apply here, if we go back to the main tab, we can see how much the NVMe drives inside our server are using. and also the temperature as well. So my NVMe is using about 3/4 of a watt. Now let's go back to the settings tab here, and in Unraid 7 we've got this power mode. Now if I click onto this, you can see I've set my server to be on best power efficiency, but there are these other two as well that we can have here. Balanced, which my CPU doesn't support, so that option's grayed out for me, but many CPUs do support that. I think AMD ones, they often do. And I could also put it on best performance, but obviously because this build is all about power efficiency, well, it makes sense to have best power efficiency, of course. So I'm going to leave mine on that. Okay, so let's go back to the main tab. So we can see the power usage during a parity sync. My server's using about 60 watts. So let's actually cancel the parity sync for the time being. And we don't want to wait 15 minutes for all of these to spin down. So let's manually do that by coming down to the bottom and clicking on the spin down button. So this will spin down all of the drives in the server except for any SSDs and NVMe's. So this one is always going to be on using the 3/4 of a watt. So all of my bulk storage drives are spun down. I do have these Docker containers running, MB Nextcloud, Nextcloud's database, and a Cloudflare tunnel for Nextcloud. These are all running, and obviously as my system share and my app data are on the cache drive, for those containers to actually run, well, no drives need to be spun up here. So let's go across and have a look at how much power is currently being used. It's using, I'd say, probably around 25 watts. It seems to be going between, oh, it's gone up to 29 there, but that's actually probably because if we stay here and have a look at the power usage of the NVMe, every now and then this will spike up, probably to about 5 or 6 watts. That's when the containers are probably going to be using this and reading some data off it. So let's see if we wait a moment if we can catch that doing that. Oh, yeah, it did it then. Did you see it? It just jumped up over 6. So anyway, for this server, the least amount of power it's probably going to use, with all drives spun down, is around the 25 watt mark. Now, what I think is going to be really interesting is seeing how different PSUs actually affect the power usage of a server. But before we go and look at different PSUs, I'm going to go across to the Docker tab here and I'm going to open up MB. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a TV show here. Now, to make sure it keeps playing, I'm actually going to drag it into another window and keep it playing. So back on the main tab here, we can see this one drive has spun up. And that's because obviously the TV show is being played and the media is on this disk. Now, what I really like to do, if we look on this disk here, I've only got TV shows on this disk. Now, with my servers and Unraid arrays, I always like to keep different things on different disks. So if we look at disk 3 here, we can see I've just got some emulation stuff. And disk 4, for instance, that's just got movies. Now, the reason I do this is because if I had, say, my TV shows spread out over all 4 of these disks, when I went to play this TV show here, it would have had to have spun up all of these drives in order to find the file that it needs to play. So it would have used more power. And another really good reason, I think, to have certain shares on certain drives is you can see here that this disk is pretty much full up. So there's never really going to be anything else written to disk 1. So the only work it's going to have is reading files off disk 1 whenever I watch a TV show. So the workload for that share is write once, read many times. So by having all of the data on one disk for that particular share, it's going to make that drive last longer because the drive is going to have less work than if everything was spread over all of the disks. So that's just something to keep in mind. That type of setup isn't for everyone, but for me, I find it works really well. Okay, so let's see how much power the server's actually using. Let's go and look on the dashboard for that first. So we can see here it's using in between 30 and 35 watts. The CPU is not being used much, and at the moment the GPU isn't doing very much either. Now we can see that the file is actually playing here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to force it to transcode. I'm going to change the quality down to, say, 720p, which will force this to be transcoded. So now we can see here the iGPU is doing the transcoding work, but also the CPU is also quite busy using 50%. And the power usage, we're looking here at in between 35 and 40 watts with this workload. So when transcoding, obviously it's a more intensive workload on the server, so our power usage has gone up. Okay, so the final thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start another parity sync whilst this TV show is still playing. So this then will have some playback from disk 1 and also doing a parity sync. So that's going to stress the server out probably the most that it would ever be stressed out for my workload on this server. Okay, so let's wait till the writes start here. Okay, so now let's look at the power usage. Okay, so while the parity sync's running and the video is playing, we can see it's only using between 60 and occasionally up to about 64 watts there. And we can see the processor isn't being used very much as well, and now the GPU isn't either. So you might be thinking, well, why is that? If I bring this across here, you can see that it's transcoding down to 720p, but the GPU is not being used at all. Now that's because it's done the transcoding already and it will now be playing that. And what I do with my transcoding, if you look at the template of MB here, is I set the transcode path to be /dev/SHM. And what this does is use the server RAM as a location for transcoding. So the good thing about that is it doesn't actually use any of the drives for a transcode location. Now, if we actually have a quick look in that location, we can see there's the transcoding temp, and let's have a look inside there. We can see there is the Andromeda transcoding files. Now looking here, we can see that the GPU transcode, we can see the transcoding started again, and we're now going up to in between kind of 68 and 71 watts. Now it's transcoding again because a new episode started playing. So this is probably the most stress that my server can have, transcoding and doing a parity sync. Okay, so I think that's enough tests on this server for the time being. So now I think let's do the exact same tests again, but let's pop this power supply in the server. This is a Corsair Gold power supply replacing the Platinum one. And let's see exactly, if any, how much difference that makes to the power draw of the server. Okay, I'm going to fit that in now and I'll be right back. Okay, so let's put this PSU inside the server. Now this is actually a 650 watt PSU and it's gold rated. So let's take out the RX750 and put this one in. Okay, all done. So now let's boot back up and do some comparisons. Okay, so with the Corsair Gold PSU, let's log into the server. Now all the disks are spun down. So let's see how much power this is using with the Gold PSU. Oh, okay, so interestingly, it's actually using less power than it was with my Platinum PSU. It's using around 21 to 23 watts idle. So that's quite interesting. I'm wondering if maybe my Platinum PSU, being quite a lot older than these other ones that I've just recently bought here for this video, well, maybe, I don't know, because it was old, it's just lost its efficiency. Because here, you know, 21 watts, well, that's pretty good for an idle server with a 71 terabyte array. Okay, so I think first what we'll do again is let's play a TV show episode again. And again, disk 1 is spun up. And we're using about 35-36 watts. And are we transcoding at the moment? So yes, that is with the transcode going. So again, using less power than before. So 34-35 watts. Transcoding a video, 55% CPU usage, and 1 drive spun up. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video playback. And now let's spin up all of the drives. And with all drives spun up, let's see what power we're using. Okay, so under 50 watts, we're, well, actually spiking to over 50 watts, but it looks like we're using I would say between 45 and 53 watts. Maybe an average of about 48 watts. So pretty power efficient really for 5 drives all spun up. So next let's do a parity sync and have all the drives working hard. Okay, so the parity sync started. Let's see how much power we're using. Okay, so we're using 62, 63 watts here, up to 65 then for a moment. It looks like it's around 60 to 62 watts. So again, pretty power efficient for running a parity sync. Now the last test again is having the parity sync running and playing a TV show. And so that's taking us up to about 70 watts max here, 69, 70 watts. Let's check if we're transcoding. And yes, that's with transcoding, playing back a video, running our parity sync, and we're using around 70 watts. So this is probably the most that the server will use with this Gold PSU. Now, like I said, I'm pretty surprised it was more efficient than the Platinum PSU, but that could just be because of the age of that PSU. Okay, so I think on to the next PSU now. Another Corsair one, but this time the bronze-rated PSU. Okay, so next PSU. So this one is the CX650. Now it looks quite similar to the other one, which is also a 650 watt PSU, but this one is not modular and this one is a bronze-rated PSU. Okay, so let's open the case, remove the RM650 and replace it with this, the CX650. Okay, great, so the next PSU's in, so let's shut the lid and boot up the server. Okay, so we've got the bronze power supply in the server now, and as you can see, all the drives are spun down, Docker containers are running. So let's go to the dashboard here, and we can see we're using 25, 26 watts. In fact, let's look at it on a bigger screen. Okay, so in between 25, 26, but going up to here 28 or even sometimes 29 watts. So it definitely does seem that this power supply, this bronze one, is not as power efficient as the gold. Now it's giving us a similar power efficiency to my old Platinum power supply. Now, like I said, I think that old Platinum one is probably just not performing as it should because it's quite old. So I think I'm going to take one out of another server I've got after we've tested the budget power supply and see if my 1000 watt Corsair Platinum power supply gives us better results, at least closer to the gold one. Okay, so let's go through and do the same tests as we did before. So I think the first thing, let's go to the Docker tab and play a TV show. Okay, and let's play another episode of Andromeda. As normal, this is in another window, so I'm going to move it out of the way. Let's have a look at the dashboard first, and we can see we're transcoding and using in between 37 up to about 43 watts. So not too bad. Seems to be staying pretty much under 40 watts. So obviously, going back to the main tab, we've got disk 1 spun up as normal. So that's one drive spun up. Playing a video with transcoding is pretty much staying under the 40 watt mark. So I think I'm going to stop the video now. And we can see the transcoding stopped. So when it's not playing back any video and we've still got the hard drive spun up, we can see it's around probably 31 to maybe up to 35 watts, bouncing around that area. Okay, so let's do our normal test of doing a parity sync. So all the drives are spinning up now. Let's give it a moment for the drive activity. We'll see the reads going in a moment. Okay, so all 5 drives are being used here. So let's go across to the dashboard here, and we can see here 63 watts here. Let's have a look on, okay, up to 70 watts there. So the parity sync, we can see it's using about 63 watts here. So for our last test, let's bring back MB, play another episode, make sure it's transcoding. Okay, so the transcoding started again. And now we're up to 68 watts here. Let's go back and have a look here. So yep, looks like we're staying just about under 70 watts, or up to 70 watts there. So that's the bronze PSU. Not quite as efficient as the gold, but the power supply is quite a lot cheaper. Okay, so let's shut the server down and we'll put in the Amazon budget power supply, and I hope it doesn't catch my server on fire. Okay, so let's take the lid off, get the CX650 out and put that scary budget Amazon power supply in. Okay, so the Corsair PSU's out. Okay, so the make is Vida and come to life. Well, that sounds like it should be on a horror film, like from the Reanimator or something. Okay, so while fitting the PSU, I had a little bit of a problem. I found out it only had one Molex connector and I did need two. One connector will power 4 drives, but I've got 5. So what I decided to do was to actually connect the 5th drive using a regular SATA cable and then put it on top of the case and power that from one of the SATA cables on the PSU. Okay everyone, so with that all jerry-rigged up, let's just go for it and fire up the server. Okay, so we've got the budget power supply finally in the server, and our first test is with all of the drives spun down, and as always, all the Docker containers running. So let's go across to the power monitor page and have a look. Okay, so again, it's higher than what we had with the bronze. It's actually going up to 36 watts, so 10 watts more than our bronze PSU earlier. Let's go to the Docker tab and open up NB, and let's play our episode of Andromeda. Okay, so let's look at the dashboard, and we've got the transcoding going, and we can see playing back we're actually drawing now 48 watts. Now let's check the drives. Oh, I actually just heard the server crash with that power supply. As you can see, that's totally frozen, and it certainly doesn't like that. Well, to be honest, I don't think I'm going to continue with that power supply. I think the reason it crashed and froze our screen like this is basically because the power supply is not very good. The voltages are probably not stable, and that's what you get really for a £20 or $25 power supply. It's really important in a server you buy a good quality power supply. Okay, so I think the last test I'm going to do is use this PSU here, which came out from one of my main servers. It's the HX1000i, another Platinum power supply. Now this one as well, it is fairly old, it's a few years old, but I'm going to try it and let's see what results we get. Okay, so first things first, let's de-jerry-rig this and take out the come to life power supply. So next, obviously, pop in the HX1000i PSU. Now again, I've probably been using this for about 5 years, so it is quite old, but we'll see how it compares to the others. Okay, so we've got the HX1000i Platinum Corsair PSU inside the server. All of the drives are spun down, so let's have a look and see what the power draw is. Okay, so here we can see it's going in between kind of 24 up to kind of 27 then, so probably around 25 watts again. So it's not as good as the new gold PSU I had from Corsair, the RM650. So this is quite interesting. Now I'm wondering if it may be because these power supplies, their power curves are not really designed so much to be efficient probably on such an idle power draw of kind of around 20 odd watts. But again, this PSU I've got, it is probably 5 years old, the same as the other one. And it's been inside servers I've had running pretty much 24/7. So I really think that I'm going to have to continue this video and buy a brand new Platinum power supply and make another video and just let you know the results. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think it is, why the Platinum power supplies seem to be performing worse than the gold one that I have. Maybe just Corsair's power circuits are more efficient now than they used to be when I first bought those other PSUs. Well, certainly at lower power draws anyway. So anyway, let's, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump straight in and do a parity sync. I'm not going to bother playing back a video on its own. We've already done that. Let's just actually put this right under load with a parity sync and see under load when it's using more power, how the PSU fares then. Okay, so parity sync is running. Let's have a look at how much power draw we've got. Okay, so a parity sync, we're hovering around the low 60s, 62, 61 watts. So not too bad. And I think now what I'm going to do is put it under more load. Here's NB. Let's play our video again. And now we've gone up to high 60s, staying under 70, which is pretty good. Let's just double check it is transcoding. And yes, it's transcoding. And currently we're using, well, it's staying around the 70 watts, just under 70 watts. So it seems when we're doing this type of workload, the power draw is actually quite similar to other PSUs that we've seen. Okay, so hold it everyone. This is Ed speaking here from the future, and I'm going to edit myself in because I've just received the new power supply. So let's put this in the server, do some tests, and see what this one's like. Okay, so let's super quickly unbox this PSU. Now, before we put it in, let's just compare it against the old PSU. We can see the design's changed slightly, the writing's slightly different. And also, if we look where the cables plug in, they've changed that design too slightly. Anyway, let's pop this into the server. Now, I'm not going to put the lid on the server, let's just do our tests. Okay, so we're booted up and all of the drives are spun down. So let's see what the idle power's like with a brand new Platinum power supply. Okay, so it's definitely a bit better, 24 watts there. Going down to 22, back up to 24, 25, so 27, and back down to 23. So I think it's a bit better than the other Platinum PSU, but still doesn't seem as good as the Gold. Now, what I think we need to do is I'm going to do another test. And this will be quite an interesting test anyway. What I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the power draw of the server with no hard drives in it at all. I'm going to remove all of these and just leave the NVMe in. We know how much that's using anyway, 3/4 of a watt. And let's see what the power draw is with no hard drives and just one NVMe. Okay, so we're booted back up and the hard drives are removed. We just got the one cache pool with that NVMe. So let's have a look and see how much power it's using. So it seems like it's using just over 20 watts with no hard drives installed, just the NVMe, which we know is using 3/4 of a watt. So minus that off, it's probably using about in between 19.5 and 20-ish watts. Okay, so now with the Gold PSU installed, again with all of the hard drives removed except for the NVMe, we can see now this is actually quite a lot less. It seems to be under 20 watts, going in between maybe kind of 17 and 18 watts. So really it's using about 3 watts less with no hard drives in at all. Oh, 16 there. So basically the Gold on low power draws is definitely more efficient than the Platinum. And yes, the Platinum is a 1000 watt PSU and the Gold is 650, but personally I wouldn't have actually expected that to make a big difference. Well, I'm really glad I know now, and we did all of the tests with new PSUs. Okay, anyway, I'm going to leave it there for the PSU testing, and then for the final test of the day, I'm going to pop back in the Corsair Gold PSU because that's the most efficient at idle and low workloads. And I'm actually going to pop another disk in. So I'm going to have 6 disks making up the array plus our cache drive. Now, I have got a good reason why I want to add another drive. That's because I want to see how much power load there is on the most efficient PSU with 6 drives all spun down. And then I'm going to change all of these drives, and I've got 6 2TB SSDs in a Z pool in another server. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually swap those out, and we can then see what the power difference is between using mechanical hard drives which can spin down to having the same amount of drives in the server but as SSDs. I have absolutely no idea what the difference is going to be. Anyway, so let's get that done and then we can wrap this video up. Right, okay, first things first, let's put back in the Gold RM650 into the case. Okay, so now I'm going to add the 6th hard drive to the server. Now again, remember, this is so we can compare 6 spinning Rust drives to the power used to 6 SSDs. Okay, so let's fire it up and we can see what the idle power draw is now of 6 hard drives. Okay, so the extra drives in here, all of the drives are spun down, Docker containers are running, so let's see what the power draw is. Okay, so 21 watts, 22. So really efficient with that extra drive. It's really hardly pulling any more power than it was when it had one less drive in here. So I'm not going to do any more tests. I just wanted to have 6 drives to compare this server idle against 6 drives that are SSDs. Actually, let's spin all of the drives up and let's see what the power draw is with all of these drives spun up, but no parity, no workload on the server at all. Okay, so all of the drives are spun up. Let's go back and have another look at the power use. Now hopefully it's not going to be much more above 50 watts, but let's see. Okay, so 52 watts with all of the drives spun up. So basically spinning up the drives is taking another 30 watts. So it's very power efficient when we can actually spin drives down. But anyway, let's shut this down, put the SSDs in and see what's different. Okay, so I've removed the spinning rust drives and I've put all of the SSDs into the sleds, and I'm just going to put them into the server and reboot. So the server started up and we can see here now that rather than the Unraid array, I've now got this pool here called main made of 6 SSDs. We can see that it says all of these drives are spun down, but let's take a look at the power that it's using. So it's using, well, again, around, I would say 18 to 22 watts. It seems to be sticking around kind of the 18 mark, well, as low as 17, which is really good. So what I want to show is actually when I spin these drives up, which they are now, and if we go across to power now we can see that the power is just the same. That's because SSDs always draw some power and they don't really ever spin down. So my SSD only server here is using in between say 17 and 19 watts. So for another 2 or 3 watts, like earlier I had 90 terabytes available. Now one thing to remember is if these were all spinning rust drives making the Z pool, you can see they would actually be able to spin down so long as the Z pool wasn't being used. But if you remember, I had my TV shows, they were on disk 1 if you remember. So with a Z pool you can't choose which disk it's going to go on, and so when you're using it, it's kind of all or nothing. All drives will be spun up if you're using it. If not, they can spin down, but every time you use the Z pool, it would spin up. So I think that pretty much wraps up for the time being this low power server build. We've done all of our tests, but before we go, I think I'm going to just bring up some charts and we'll have a little talk about the results that we've seen across this video. Now the results here are obviously very specific to a server that doesn't actually use a lot of power, and I think that's why we're probably seeing very similar figures across all of the different types of PSU. Platinum, gold and bronze, really all of the numbers are very, very close. With all drives spun up and no load, the figures are almost identical across all 3 types of PSU. And also with the heaviest workload we did with a parity sync and playing back some media, again, all 3 types see very, very similar figures. Now in my opinion, they're all so similar because the actual power draw on these PSUs is nowhere near their max. So the efficiency in these PSUs probably comes in when they're drawing far more power. So with the lower workloads, we're really not seeing it. Now if we were drawing say 500, 600, 700 watts, I think it'd be a totally different story. If we had an NVIDIA GPU pass through to a gaming VM and we were gaming, I think then we'd see the power efficiency of the Platinums begin to be a bit more significant in that type of scenario. Now the one thing I did find surprising was at the most idle workload with all of the hard drives spun down, that the gold PSU was more efficient than the Platinum. Anyway, so the bottom line is, if you want to have a power efficient server, in my opinion, don't worry too much about whether your PSU is Platinum, Gold or Bronze. But what we've learned from this video is we do need to make sure that it is good quality. We don't want to buy any cheap budget ones off Amazon. The power efficiency, as you can see, was absolutely awful, and plus it caused the server to crash because it couldn't even hold stable voltage. So when configuring your low power server, in my opinion, use as few as possible large spinning rust drives, have them in an Unraid array, and set them to spin down when they're not in use. Try and split up your different types of data across the different disks to stop unnecessary spin up when you need to access those files. So what other things can you do to save power? Well, we spoke about the sleep plugin, and on my Space Invader 1 channel I have made a video about sleep. So obviously being able to shut your server down for say 50% of the time, that's going to save you 50% of your power. Also some things that people don't always think about is, say your server's got built-in Wi-Fi, Can you go in the motherboard and actually disable that? Disabling hardware that's not in use, it won't save a lot, but theoretically it should save a little bit of power. And also, as we saw in this video, the Intel iGPUs are extremely efficient at transcoding. They really do just sip power compared to, say, an NVIDIA P2000. So if you're planning a low power build and you want to use things like Jellyfin Plex or MB, well, in my opinion, an Intel CPU is a really good choice for that. Now, going back to the power, let's take a look at the PSU which we had the best luck with and was the most efficient. We also tested this one as well with no spinning rust drives and just one NVMe. And in this state, the power usage was about 16 to 17 watts. Let's take it on the higher side, 17 watts. And with 5 spinning rust drives in the server all spun down, we're getting between 21 and 23 watts in that state. So let's take that as an average of about 22 watts. So the difference between the two power states is 5 watts, and there are 5 drives, so it seems like each hard drive is using 1 watt in a spun down state. So next, with all drives spun up and no load, it was using between 45 and 50 watts. So let's take the average to be, say, 47. So 47 minus 17 is 30 watts, and if we divide that by 5, that gives us 6 watts per hard drive when they're spun up and idle. So I think this is quite useful when we're planning building a low power server, because we can work out how many drives we're going to have in the server and what power usage it should use when not under load. Right, so just to round off before we go, look out how much this server with the Gold PSU idling at 21 to 23 watts would actually cost doing that for a whole year. So let's take the server idles at, say, 22 watts. And it's on 24/7 for a year. That's going to use about 192 kilowatt hours. And in the USA, as far as I'm aware, electricity is 15 cents per kilowatt hour. So that would cost $28.91 to run that server for a year. And in the UK, it's 25 pence a kilowatt hour. So that would cost me £48, so about $60 to run for the same period of time. So just for reference, here's the prices of those various PSUs that are used in the test today. So that Platinum PSU there is $173 more than the Gold. Now, yes, it is a different wattage, so it's not a direct apples to apples comparison. But for the same price I can buy that Platinum PSU, I could also buy the Gold PSU and the electricity to run the server for the next 6 years. Just something to think about. Anyway, so that wraps up this video. I really hope that you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Really hoping to get to 10,000 subscribers very, very soon on this channel. We've got loads and loads of interesting content coming, so make sure you don't miss out. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Anyway, thanks everyone for watching. I hope you have a great day and I'll catch you soon.